Welcome on behalf of the class of 60 and the class of 86, and on behalf of Barnard and on all the classes, thank you for being here. We are delighted to see so many of you at this panel, which is going to be extremely interesting. Before we get started, I'm Burl Hartman. I'm the vice president of the class of 60, and I have just a few announcements for members of the class of 1960. At 7:15 this evening, people who are interested and would like to will gather under the magnolia tree. Now, I've just gotten a lesson on which one is the magnolia tree. It's out here on the lawn, and it's the largest of the trees there. And it's not the largest?
No, but it has shiny leaves.
Shiny leaves, okay.
If one person's there, you'll recognize that.
And we will gather to remember and honor one of our dear classmates who worked very hard for Barnard and for the committee, Diana Bosted, at 7:15 this evening. The other thing for the class of 60, which was not in the program, so I want to make sure everyone knows about it, is that we will be having a luncheon tomorrow at Ann Freed's house. And for those of you who do not have this information, get out your pens and pencils, because I'm going to give you the address. The actual address is 118 Riverside Drive, but the thing you need to remember is that it's actually at the corner of 84th Street and Riverside Drive, and there's an awning over it.
The entrance is on 84th.
The entrance is on 84th, yes. And you go to the penthouse apartment. So it's going to be a great luncheon.
When?
Thank you. At 11:30 a.m. Okay, that's all the announcements.
I was afraid of that.
One other thing that I'm going to tell you about today's panel. The idea for it arose with one of our classmates at one of our reunion meetings, and the idea for it belongs to Joyce Levinson Tischler,
Yes.
who did the initial spade work to go through the alumni directory and find out who in our class listed themselves as authors and tracked these people down and somehow persuaded them to come here and be on our panel. So my great thanks to Joyce. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our classmate, Andre Abacassis, who will moderate the panel.
Hello. And one more time, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever it is. Thank you for coming. I'm Andre Abacassis. I'm a member of the class of 1960. I know we have some other people here. The title of this panel is Writers of a Certain Age, Reflection on the Arc of Our Careers. Today, we have 6 Barnard graduates who have spent their lives in some aspect of writing, or I should say the writing world, and have a varied perspective on this adventure. When we graduated, we were fortunate to have a president named Millicent McIntosh, or as she was affectionately known, Millie Mac, who exhorted us, you can do anything. As you will see, despite being the generation before the baby boomers, and despite being the so-called silent generation, in fact, we took up her challenge and have successfully done anything and everything, and continue to do so today. If one theme links all of our panelists, is being open to opportunities, artistically, professionally, commercially. Each of these women has had experiences that led her to be open to the proverbial and beneficial fork in the road. Although some of them were professional writers, even in freshman English and before, others came to their careers at a later stage. It's a truly wonderful group of writers, and as Sarah Silberger said last year, I suspect that many of our classmates could be up here as well. Our plan is this. The panelists will talk for 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, so listen. We're going to work alphabetically. So my last name begins with A. So if I may briefly explain how I fit into this panel. Background. I was the editor of the Barnard Bulletin, a twice-weekly campus newspaper back in the 1950s. I was a local correspondent for the old New York Herald Tribune. My journalistic path led to an 8-year stint as a magazine editor, followed by a whole new world of working in television for Channel 13, WNET, right here in New York City. One critical and unexpected fork in the road came when the television gig ended, and most of the staff was laid off, by the way, including me, and I went west to California, where for many years I was happily a freelance reporter and a professional photographer. I got to see the world and photographed many intriguing subjects, including the then 26-year-old Steve Jobs, long before anybody had ever heard of Apple. I also managed to teach in the community college system. As age crept up and the camera gear got heavier and heavier, I changed careers again, this time opening a literary agency in Northern California. I figured it was easier to grow old talking on the telephone rather than carrying all that equipment. And now, after 15 years in the book business, we're coping again, this time with the digital world. But that's for another discussion. So, on to our wonderful group of writers. Our first panelist is Rosellen Brown, who has been, as far as I can tell, a writer forever. She is an award-winning novelist, a poet, a teacher. She'll tell us how she started and how she has coped with the arc of her career, as well as her intriguing solution to what's next. Posey Brown.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a delight. I hope some of you were at the Mary Gordon lecture. I hope you're not going to overdose on writers, but let me start by saying, first of all, that 5 minutes is really difficult. Half an hour, you can go on easily. 5 minutes really gives me the willies. It's very hard to decide what it is that you need to talk about. I want to start by saying that I think the world is divided into two kinds of people. The kind of people who think the world can be divided into two kinds of people, and those who don't. And I do believe, though, that there are two kinds of writers. The kind who, as Andre said, were always writing, and those who came to it late. In many ways, I was lucky to have, for example, entered a marriage knowing that I was a writer, and my husband had been forewarned, because I know a great many women who had to renegotiate the marriage contract after they determined that if it wasn't writing, it was something that they didn't know when they got married. So I suppose in that way, I'm grateful that I began writing when I was 9. I won't go into the details of how that happened, but I do remember it very clearly. I came to Barnard with tremendous passion for writing. I had done journalism in high school. I did these, some of you may remember this kind of thing in the high school newspaper, these very self-conscious articles about how we're all conformists and there are those who march to a different drummer and so on. But I had a wonderful teacher who used to lock me into the room where the newspaper was produced to make me finish these things. And from that, what I got was that I could be taken seriously as a writer, which, you know, whether my articles were of any use to anybody or not, I don't know, but I took that from that experience. And actually, when I think back to it, I had the wit to thank that teacher before he died. Usually you say, why didn't I ever write a letter to whoever it was so useful to me? And it's too late. I actually did thank him because it was so important for me to know that somehow I had a voice that was, you know, it was worth locking me in to do my work. I got to Barnard, and this is paradoxical. I did nothing but write when I was here, and I regret that to such an extent that I caution students who want to go direct, for example, or who want to major in writing when they're in college, or they want to go directly from college into MFA writing programs, and I teach in one, and I say to them, don't do that. That is a terrible thing to do. You will be like me. You will totally neglect your education, which I think I did. I did not take advantage of the education that Barnard could have given me, but what I did take advantage was, and Mary Gordon spoke about the two people who were really useful to her here, there were two writers, Robert Pack, and it helped to fall in love with him. I mean, that's always useful. It's the way you learn a foreign language, and, you know, I mean, you know, this was not acted upon. This was the kind of thing that Mary actually was talking about. But it helps to kind of keep the passion level up for your work. And Bob Pack, with whom I've been friendly ever since, he is now in his mid-80s, and we still talk from time to time. He taught me, it wasn't so much the matter of what he taught me, but he taught me to revise, which Mary also said. A lot of things have been said first today. He taught me to you know, attach the seat of my pants to the chair and do it again and again and again, which turns out to be, as Mary said, the most important thing you can possibly do. And I say this the day after I met with editors yesterday, with whom I had a conversation that told me that I have to take a novel I've been writing and sit down and do the whole thing over again. And I've learned the discipline, and I can certainly do it. The other writer, and I'll just speak about him for a second, was George P. Elliot, a man who should have been much better known than he was, who really in many ways taught me he was a very sweet man, and I don't mean that in any pejorative way, and he taught me to be humane in my writing, or to try to be humane. It's not always easy, but, okay. Half a minute. I get a half a minute extra for stopping for that. What I want to say about the paradox of regretting the fact that I did nothing but write when I was at Barnard, and when I graduated, I got a book because they gave me a book as a prize for poetry, and then some kind of a vague prize about being most likely. It wasn't most likely to succeed, but it's most likely to persevere in your given line of work. And I remember thinking, what line is that? Because graduating as a writer, what do you do? I went to graduate school. But what I wanted to say about the paradox of feeling regretful about this is that here I am nearing the end of my career and feeling, well, but I got what I wanted to out of what I thought was really the wrong path taken, because I'm doing what I hoped I would do. And I think it was wrong-headed for me. I was willful. I look at my students who have come right out of college into graduate school, and I think you are just like me. You cannot be dissuaded from doing this, but somebody should have tried. But I know, in fact, that you could not have been dissuaded. So let me go into the future. Am I fine? Okay. What I want to talk about a little bit is what the writing life is like, because everybody that you meet at a party says, I've got a book in me. If only I had a spare weekend, I could really get that thing down. And now in the age of memoir, you don't even have to be able to make it up. You can just think you can remember it and get it down on paper. Needless to say, that's absurd. The other people that I don't like meeting at parties are the ones who say, "Are you still writing?" My parents-in-law thought it was a hobby, and I could never convince them that this was, I don't want to call it a business, but it was it's a business as well. But what I wanted to say about what's difficult, Linda Kerber, who I wish was here, but she's at a history conference this year. Linda Kerber and I have an ongoing kind of it's not an argument, but it's it's an endless conversation about which of us has the harder job. She is a historian. And I say, oh my God, Linda, you have to find the facts, you have to understand the context, you have to figure out how to put them together, you have to be convincing, you have to make this dead stuff live. That just seems to be incredibly difficult. And she says, Posey, you have to make the damn thing up from scratch. How could that be easy? And I'm not a natural storyteller, and if anybody's read my work, they are not actually very plotted stories. And so I think the thing that I want to say about that is that the worst thing I have found about being a writer, there are great things, there are great perks. I mean, I taught in Italy for 15 summers. I have been on many, many campuses. I have gotten to travel. When I met Barack Obama, who's a neighbor of mine, he told me, I don't know if this is true or not, told me he'd read one of my books, Civil Wars, and I didn't quiz him on it, but he knew something about it. He reads novels, so, I just like to dine out on that story. So a lot of wonderful things have happened. There was a movie made of one of my books. It was a horrible movie, but there was a little money in that. I got a hug from Liam Neeson, and I got to talk to Meryl Streep. That was worth it. It was a terrible, terrible movie. If you see it, it's on television all the time. Don't watch it. Read the book, before and after. Read the book. But what I wanted to say about it is that the worst thing for me about being a writer is, in many ways, what Linda was saying, that I have to construct the entire thing. And in addition to constructing it, which is presumably some pleasure, I forgot to mention before, there is some pleasure in writing for me, but it is to keep some kind of faith that this matters. And I really mean this very seriously. I can spend weeks and weeks on a story. I spent 5 years writing the book that Barack said he read. I've written other books, one that took 9 months. It depends. But the point is that the value of it Not even only, not just the personal, the sense of, am I doing it well enough? That's a slightly separate thing. The very existence of fiction or poetry as something that matters in the world has to be defended. You have to defend it every day. And I sink into despondency very often when I think, who the hell gives a damn? I have piles of literary magazines. Some of them I subscribe to, some of them are sent to me, and they have stories in them that somebody has slaved over the way I do. I don't get a chance to read them. I don't know who else gets the chance to read them. You have to say to yourself, it matters anyway. And I don't know if you feel this, Kathy, but there's almost a sort of a sense that you have to keep touching of an abstract value. There must be art in the world. And if that's what you do, then God damn it, you've got to believe that it is worth doing. But I have to tell you, this is really, I find it very difficult. Yeah. Okay, one more minute. Oh my God, 9 minutes. Forget it. I will stop at that. I will just say that thank God there are readers like you, because the people in this room constitute the best readers, at least for the kind of work that I do. We'll hear about other kinds of work, and you probably have other kinds of readers, but I am very, very grateful to all of you. Okay.
Thank you, Posey. That's just wonderful. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Catherine Parrots, and she also has been writing forever. She will tell you her wonderful Cinderella publishing history, including how she spent her 25th birthday. And when she fast forwards to the present, she'll tell us about her ingenious new project. Kathy.
Thank you. I agree with what Rosellen said just now, Posey, that, I mean, once you're stuck, once you're a writer, you just, even if you're not published, which I am stunningly not, I mean, my arc is sort of like the stock market after 2000, you know, it was way up there. The NASDAQ was at 5,000. And then, anyway, but you're still a writer. You see things as a writer. You keep on writing. I don't know why. My story is a kind of, a sort of a miracle. I also wrote when I was at Barnard. I was a transfer student, and on weekends I'd go home. My parents lived on the island. Put on one of those all-in-one pajamas that babies have. Only it was a 6-foot all-in-one pajama, and I would just write all weekend and not see anyone, and then come to school. When I graduated, I was a little younger than I was 20, and instead of having had my junior year abroad, I thought I'd go on for a PhD in comparative lit, but I decided to take a year off, and I went to England, and I wrote a book. In 2 weeks. At a party, I met another blonde American young woman who had published a book called she was called Sally Belfridge. And I asked if she would look at my book. I had met no one in publishing and anything to do with publishing. She said, "Do you mind if I show it to a friend of mine?" I said, "No." And I got a call from someone who was called James Mickey. He was editor-in-chief of Heinemann. And he invited me to have a drink, and that was it. Heinemann, who publishes the Bible, Tolstoy, D.H. Lawrence, published me. Then I came home, that was 1960. That was the year we graduated. I came home and for Christmas, and a young woman who worked at Athenaeum, which had just started publishing, took my book there, and Hiram Hayden said yes, and then in France, and so on. So it wasn't very difficult. I mean, my image, it really was the Cinderella wand, because suddenly I was a writer. And so young, I didn't have any other identity yet, so it was, you know, Dostoevsky had his era, and this was mine. Sorry, Posey, but that's how it felt. And by the time I married, at 27, I think I had 4 books out. So it all happened And I wrote very, very quickly. My 25th birthday, which I wrote about, this connects up because Ellen will talk for Galen Williams, who founded Poets and Writers. They had a 25th anniversary, and Galen asked me to write something. So I wrote about turning 25, which I did in London. I was at an elegant Chelsea townhouse in London, and Sean Connery was at this party. My book had just come out, and this was Sunday, and it was Fiction of the Week in the Observer, and it also got the top review in the Times and the top. Anyway, so the party was supposedly for him, but everyone crowded around me, including Sean Connery, and I said, you know, please stand a little further back, because I knew fame is an aphrodisiac, and just don't do it. But of course, I guess this was unusual behavior around him, because he kept pursuing. And as it was about 11:30, the eve of my birthday, and Sean Connery said, let's go. So I walked out past the absolutely hating eyes of our hostess, you know, taking him out into the white Jaguar, and we drove to the Thames embankment. And as Big Ben told the hour to the left, midnight, I turned, and the white Jag was parked over there. For some reason, I had a red flower in my hand, and I was in the arms of and being kissed by James Bond. So that was the moment. I mean, that's the top of the graph. And when you talk about arcs, so since then, it's sort of fluttered down. Then I married about 2 years later an Englishman who had a couple of children and did not change his name. And since I had more books than he had children, I didn't change mine. And it was a marriage. We're now married 44 years. And as I say, once you get over the first 40, the rest is very easy. But it was tough because I was a writer first and not interested in any of the other things. So of course I loved my child, but it was very tough to be a writer, because in being a writer, I used to go away somewhere, away from the city, in a farmhouse, or in Austria, in a little place in Dea in Mallorca, and I would just write. I wrote like a cistern, you know. It would slowly fill up, and then I'd go off and write, and it went whoosh, and it all came out, and I was no age, no sex, no nationality. I was just writing. So that was in contrast. After I married, I wrote more nonfiction. I wrote some nonfiction. And then later in my life, I wrote, in collaboration, a couple of books under a pseudonym. The collaborator, whom I called the Frog, not because he was French, but because he looked like one. And he wrote the huge outlines, and then I'd write the books by Joanna Kingsley. And those were published in paper, 1 million copies, 18 foreign languages, and for a few years I made 6 figures. So, but that was the only time that happened.
Why did you use a pseudonym?
That is a long... I was brought into it after the person who should have been collaborating wasn't.
These were novels?
These were novels. They were what I call commercial novels, which, I'm sorry, it's too complicated. It's through agent and blah, blah, blah. It was and it was a male writer who wanted to write since the audience was female. Anyway, I had my last contract with him was for 2 books, and there were 2 of us, but still it was for $750,000. And it never worked. By this time, he thought I shouldn't be getting as much money as I was getting, and he wanted to find someone who would be cheaper. It just disintegrated very nastily. And the next book I wrote was about writing those books, called Writing for Love and Money, where I got 0 advance, and it was published by University Press. Since then, I have been writing. We moved into the city from Long Island, and all of a sudden, my eyes got to enjoy themselves. I mean, I had been sitting in rooms. Once we moved to the city, I treated it like Paris. I just walked everywhere. I sat in, if not cafes, in Starbucks, and watched people go around, looked at paintings. It was a whole shift to the visual. But I have no more time. Okay.
30 seconds. Tell us your new project briefly.
I continue to write, and I've written. I'm not going to tell you about my current book.
Okay, it's a great book. Great idea. It's got a wonderful idea. Thank you so much. Forgive me for cutting you off. Our next speaker is Carol Prizant. And one might say that Carol came to her writing career by inadvertently needing to look for a bargain. As students, many of us bought, used furniture, spending frugally, buying cheaply. Little did Carol know that someday all this experience would lead to a career writing about antiques, and as well as writing the Bible for the popular PBS series Antiques Roadshow. She'll tell us how she got there and what's next. Carol?
Hi. I'm going to do some name dropping too, so hang on. When I came to Barnard, I too was a writer, but I had a huge hiccup in between Barnard and my actual writing career. That began with marriage after 2 years. So I left, and if you don't know me, that's why. I was gone in 2 years. I had a bit of good luck here, though, because I competed in the poetry contest for Greek Games, and actually, Posey, I beat you.
Oh. I won 1 year, you must have won the other year.
But you weren't aware of me.
And we got crowned with bay leaves.
I did, actually, yeah. That, however, allowed me, after I married and moved to Boston, to be accepted in, here it comes, Robert Lowell's poetry class, where there were 4 of us. I forget who the other 2 were, but one was Anne Sexton. And I did not belong there. It was so over my head, and there were so many things zinging around that room that I didn't begin to understand. So I got pregnant and, and had a baby and moved to my first big apartment where I needed a lot of furniture. Not a lot, I needed some furniture. And because we didn't have money, I used to go to, I have a cheat sheet on my life here, excuse me. I shopped for cheap used furniture, which then was not called vintage, it was called used furniture. And you could buy a desk for $50, or you could buy a chair for $2, and I did that. Eventually, I got a whole place furnished with these really nice, cheap things, and my mother came to visit, and I was at a loss for what to do. I had a baby, I had a young husband. I was living in a foreign city, Boston. And she said, here's $200. You're so good at buying these old things. Go into business. So $200. It took me 3 months to spend $200. And I bought everything that nobody needed, cups and saucers and shoe shine stands and stuffed toys. Anyhow, I wound up on Long Island. because my husband took a job on Long Island, and I moved there with him and began to do antique shows. I did the first 26th Street flea market. For anyone who remembers it, I was there with the table. I did the Armory, I did Madison Square Garden. Eventually, I opened a shop on Long Island, and I lived in my shop. Yes, I did. I resented my customers because they interfered with my reading. What I really liked was buying, and I was good at buying. I did what antique dealers call sharpshooting. You go to another shop, you find something that you know something about that they don't, and you buy it cheap and you sell it for a lot of money. So I did that for a very long time and wound up with a fairly successful antiques business when my husband and I began to restore old houses. It sounds like a business. It wasn't. We lived in first one and then another historic house. And I decided to furnish them to the period, which required a lot of research. I had a son in there somewhere who grew up, went away to school, stayed away, as sons tend to do. And so I was occupying myself with restoring houses. I bought a magazine, an English magazine called The World of Interiors, which was very beautiful and full of pictures of real houses that were indeed historic, that had the original curtains and carpets, and I used them as a form of research. And one day, in the midst of this, I decided to write to the editor. She had put out an antique supplement, which I interpreted to mean that they were going to start a whole antiques magazine. And I wrote to her and I said, if you do this in New York, I would love to represent you. It was very forward of me and very unlike me, actually. And lo and behold, this woman wrote back and she said, we're not starting an antiques magazine at all, but would you like to write for us? It was a second career. It was a life. I couldn't believe it. It would never have happened in America because I had no credentials. I didn't even have a college degree. Ladies.
When you left here, you didn't finish.
I didn't finish. I never finished. I am degreeless to this day. She gave me a job writing for this magazine. That was 22 years ago. I am still on the masthead. I still represent the magazine here in the United States. And because of that offer, I began to be picked up by the Times and the New Yorker and all sorts of magazines that liked my style, and I developed a career. And along about 1999, Peter Workman of Workman Publishing called me and said, I have this book coming up. It's about the Antiques Roadshow. Would you like to do it? It was like the perfect wave. And people wonder, why did Peter call you? The truth is that, and this is the big secret of publishing, that his wife had been my bridesmaid. So for all of you who are looking for an in, I highly recommend it. After that, I did, the first book was Antiques Roadshow Primer, and I traveled with the Roadshow. The second book, which came 3 years later, was Antiques Roadshow Collectibles, which was the other stuff, you know, the Shirley Temple dolls. And I don't want to offend anybody here. I won't go on with collectibles. And finally, about 3 years ago, I published a book called Good, Better, Best, which is about antiques and how you distinguish good from better from best. And my whole life has come into this focus. That's why calling this an arc bothered me a little bit, because an arc has a down. I like a trajectory. Works better for me. After that Antiques book, I published a book about all the dogs of my life, which turned into a memoir. It began with the dogs and turned into a story about my son and my husband and myself. And I am now, are you ready? I'm working on a novel.
All right. Yay.
So that's it, gang. I mean, it's been terrific. I've been very lucky, very, very lucky. It's been great, and I hope there will be more of it.
Sounds terrific. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Ruth Lewin-Syme. Ruth is a professor of chemistry who, after graduate school, was, lo those many moons ago, traveling the bumpy, shall I say, treacherous roads of the halls of academe. In the 1970s, not always an easy path for women. Then a friend asked her to teach a course on the history of women in science, which in turn led her to realize there had been sort of a cover-up involving a Nobel laureate and his failing to mention a certain colleague, female, who had been instrumental in the prize-worthy discovery. And so a biography of physicist Lisa Meitner was born. Ruth will tell us this history and of the second biography to come. Ruth?
Thank you. When I was thinking of what to say today, I realized that it was going to be a feminist narrative, because the women's movement was so important in my getting started on this biography of a woman. So I thought I would look back in that sense to being at Barnard. I was a math and chem major here at Barnard. Thinking back, it's so astonishing how we didn't know or had no way how to plan what we were going to do, or at least that was true for me. It was just all fuzzy. And probably it was because there were so many restrictions on women's career, obvious ones, single digits for med school and law school and who knows what for grad school. Anyway, when I did get into grad school, Bernice Siegel, our professor here, who many of you remember, of course, for physical chemistry, she warned me. She said, "Don't quit, or Harvard will never take another woman." And this was the essence of the exception aspect of what we were doing. It wasn't even up to the point of tokenism at that point. We were just exceptions. And we didn't challenge the rules to which we thought we would be exceptions. That wasn't what you did then. At least in my experience, we didn't even think to do that. There was no mechanism for doing that. Anyway, maybe because of Bernice Siegel's warning, I did stick it out, although I surely did not find Harvard a very welcoming place. Not just because I was a woman, it was a pretty unwelcoming place for a lot of people. But I did stick it out, and it's one of my regrets, actually, that during the time of the civil rights movement, which is exactly the time that I was in grad school, I didn't have the courage to leave and do what I felt I should have done. I still regret this, and to take a more significant part in the civil rights movement. Anyway, there were just a handful of us women at Harvard. We were totally atomized, pun intended. There was no solidarity between us. When I think back to that, it's just remarkable how my experience with being a woman at that time was. Being at Harvard convinced me that I was much more in love with teaching than I was with doing research. And that was a good decision for me, because teaching is really what I feel was my primary profession. And there were jobs. Maybe I was tired of elite private institutions, because I ended up in California and always was in the public institutions. First at California State Universities in Southern California, and then I came to Sacramento. I'll go very quickly. Got jobs. That was a time where there was plenty. They even hired women. And I met my husband at California State University, Sacramento. I was an assistant professor. He was, I guess, already associate in the same department. We got married, and all of a sudden I was out of a job. Anti-nepotism rules. And so I had finally hit the gender barrier to which there was no exceptions that I could do anything about at the time. And of course, I was mad. And fortunately, I got a job at what turned out to be the best possible place for me, which was at the community college, Sacramento City College. It was just a wonderful place because, in my experience, community college is a place where teaching really matters, and one could really feel good as a person in the community and affecting people's lives. So it was a perfect job for me. But on principle, I sued this chemistry department at Sacramento State. That was a few years later when there finally were some laws. And based on Title IX laws, I think I don't remember the details anymore. Some of the attorneys here can perhaps help me out, but there was EEOC. And we sued, to make a long story short, went to federal court. I lost. The judge said, you know, of course there should be anti-nepotism laws. Who wants a husband and wife in the same department? So, however, the chemistry department after that never hired another man. I was the first woman they'd ever hired, and after the suit, which they won, they actually did hire nothing but women. They didn't want this kind of trouble again. So they, also I had become quite notorious, and because of this, I got a phone call one day from some of the women at Sacramento State asking if I would teach a course in women in science. And I still remember the phone call because I was so stunned by it, because I realized I knew nothing about women in science, nothing. Went to Barnard, learned nothing about women in science. Went to Harvard for sure, learned nothing about women in science. And in fact, at that moment, the only woman I could think of was, you know, Marie Curie, of course. And so, of course, I said yes. And in teaching the course, I learned that throughout history, there have always been women in mathematics and science. But historians treated these women badly. They neglected them in subsequent generations. So in every generation, women were always the exceptions, never the pioneers. And I came across a woman, Lisa Meitner at that point, a physicist. She was very well known. I had heard of her before. She was known in connection with the discovery of nuclear fission, and it was known that she had worked with Otto Hahn, a very famous chemist, and he had gotten the Nobel Prize. She had not, but her name was still known. But as this was about 1972 or 3, it was clear as one read the material that she was in the process of becoming invisible, like so many of these women before. And I realized that this was a very interesting project. I started reading what I could of her, Otto Hahn's autobiographies, and I still remember the moment when I read one of his autobiographies and I realized she wasn't even there. They had known each other for 30 years. They had worked together. They were the closest of colleagues and friends. And yet there was almost nothing of her in there. And I remember how shocked I was. And I also remember thinking that if I had read that same book 5 years earlier, I would have just accepted it. I had not understood those things at this point. Anyway, it was very fortunate. There turned out to be a lot of material. And it was the feminist impulse that started this book, but it turned out that the material that was there really showed that this hunch, the supposition was correct. Lisa Meitner had, in fact, been crucial as a physicist to the discovery of nuclear fission, and her exclusion from it, from recognition from it, was unjust. So I realized I had the material to write a biography, and I emphasize the writing because if one is constructing a historical narrative that challenges the existing history, then you have to have a lot of footnotes. And you can only do that in writing. You can't do it. You can do a lot of things with performance and film and other media, but you cannot have footnotes, and you need those, and a lot of them, if you're going to convince serious historians that what you're writing is in fact an accurate narrative. So the woman's narrative of marginalization was definitely there, but it turned out that that was not the primary narrative of this biography, because the main source of Lisa Meitner's exclusion was that she was a Jew in Germany, and she was forced to emigrate in 1938. She had worked with Hahn and another chemist, Strassman, for years on this project, and a few months before the discovery took place, she was forced out. She went to Sweden, and it was because she was an exile, a Jewish exile, she could not publish with Hahn and Strassman, and so her name was not on the crucial publication that constituted the discovery of fission. And the rest of her marginalization followed from that. So this then became, in fact, a story of forced immigration and displacement and loss, all the general themes that we find in these narratives, loss of home and work, and basically one's place in the world. And this was the story that engaged me most strongly, even more so, I would say, than the women's narrative. My parents were refugees from Germany, and this aspect of Lisa Meitner's story was the one that I really wanted to most know and explore, and also tell. Every immigration story is different, and in Lisa Meitner's, the crucial aspect was her relationship with Otto Hahn. So this biography also, in a sense, Hahn was the important second character in this throughout, because they really were good friends, and because he really was a good German in the sense that he was opposed to Nazism. He had been her friend as long as she was in Germany. But then, when she was gone, he couldn't admit to his ongoing collaboration with her, and he began, at that point, a few months after the discovery, to write her out of the discovery. It was a betrayal, a true betrayal, and it raises all those questions that one has of complicity and acquiescence and collaboration, compromise. And then after the war, the questions of silencing and forgetting, which was so prevalent in the in the post-war generation. And so that, of course, has brought me to my current research, which is that I am writing a political biography of Otto Hahn. There's been lots. There've been lots of autobiographies and biographies of him, but they've been pretty adulatory, including his own. And so there needs to be a critical examination, and that's what I'm doing now.
That's great. Thank you so much. Ellen Joseph is our last speaker, and in her own right, Ellen Joseph is a successful New York attorney. She has, however, graciously accepted to be here to describe the adventures and career of her friend, our classmate, Galen Williams. Galen is a landscape designer, and this time of year is high season out in the Hamptons for that profession, so she's out in the field. However, you may recognize the other hat that Galen wears as the director and catalyst of Poets and Writers, one of the largest nonprofit organizations in the country for writers of poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. Ellen is a board member of Poets and Writers, and she's going to talk about how it was started and the evolution of the group. Ellen, thank you.
Galen will hear from me about this job she gave me, standing in for her. But I indeed feel, and I quote from Posey, that Galen has done something that truly matters in the world, to have created an organization, Poets and Writers, and that has grown and is now indeed the largest national nonprofit organization for the professional development of poets and writers and creative nonfiction writers, that promotes communication throughout the literary community, and tries to help create an environment in which writing is literature, not just writing, but literature can be appreciated by the widest possible public. Galen had been, when she graduated from Barnard as an English major, and that's how she and I met. We were both transfer students, and we had to, and we were both English majors, but we had to have a science course. So we met over a dissecting table in the zoology lab, and that's how our friendship was started, and my involvement in Poets and Writers developed out of that. But Galen, after graduation, went to work for the 92nd Street Y, which at the time really was one of the few places that had poetry readings, literature readings, and workshops for writers. And she worked there and ended up being the director of their poetry center. She worked there for 10 years and got to know, among other people, the director of the New York State Council on the Arts, John Hightower. And at a point when Galen, who was married and was pregnant with her second child, wanted to kind of drop out of running the WISE program, she was very worried in particular about the aspect of the program that used money from the New York Council on the Arts to give cash directly to poets for the readings. It was an instrument by which actual dollars, maybe $100, we were talking very small money, but at that time it really mattered, a way of funneling money into the hands of writers for readings and for workshops. So John Hightower said, you can't give this up. Galen suggested they move the program to another organization. He says, you start a new organization to handle this program of providing money to writers to give readings and to run workshops. And that was how Poets and Writers was born. It started in Galen's little apartment and with a volunteer help, one of whom has been for many years a superb executive director of the organization. Everybody keeps going with it. And the organization is over 40 years old. It's grown from a staff of 2 to a staff of 20, from a budget of $30,000, all state contribution, to a $3.5 million budget, to having now not only the original readings and workshops program, which remains one of the core programs, but also has a magazine which grew out of what had originally been a little newsletter called Coda. And I have a bunch of magazines here. Anybody who's interested is welcome to take it. Wonderful prize-winning magazine that has to do not with publishing the writing of writers, but helping them with articles and information and lists, etc., to be professional writers, to get out there and be able to actually exist in the world as a writer. They have a wonderful website, which I encourage you all to visit, and it's pw.org, couldn't be easier. They originally provided information people would call, and they serviced many calls every year for information. Gradually, the information services became a little more formal, and in particular, the National Endowment for the Arts gave them seed money to start a directory, which then went into all the libraries, universities, and so on. And when it started, which was in 1973, the first directory of American poets, there were 1,300 poets listed. You had to be published. You couldn't just say, I'm a poet, get in. But you didn't have to be published a whole lot. Now, there are 8,400 plus American writers listed in the directory. And it's online now. It used to actually be a hard volume, and now it's online. The other aspect that has really grown is early on, it was also 1973 that Galen started just a newsletter that they called Coda. And that newsletter, and was free initially. After a few years, they charged a little bit of money for it. But that developed into what is a prize-winning and quite wonderful magazine filled with information, articles, lists, and so on for people who want to be professional writers. It's not a how-to, except in a way of giving people information about how other writers have made it, and information about all of the things that would be helpful for a writer's development. So as I said before, I've got a stack of them here, and while they last, if anybody wants a copy, please help yourselves, but it's quite terrific. They also have, through the years, raised enough money and started an endowment and so on, and so that they're now not just in New York, but there is a California program, California office, and a director. They're based in Los Angeles, and a staff of 2 there full-time. They also have, in very recent years, been able to have readings and workshops programs in Atlanta, Chicago, Detroit, Houston, New Orleans, Seattle, Tucson, and Washington, D.C. So it truly is a national organization in that sense, too. The core program of workshops and readings is in all of those places.
The only time I was ever a cover girl was in that magazine.
Right.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much. Technically, this is supposed to end at 2, but unless you have some pressing place to be, I'm sure everybody will be happy to answer some questions. So please, as Burl says, we invite you to stay and hang out for a bit if you can. Thank you for coming.
Does anyone have the mic?
Yeah, and some questions? Or come up and talk to the panelists directly? Okay, well, we'll be here just in case. Thank you all for coming.
Okay. Thank you to our panel.
And thank you very much to the panel.